and to start putting a plan in terms of the security controls, the areas that needs much more testing and scrutiny than other areas, and of course, putting the borders and the protections of data, of privacy, and other aspects as well becomes extremely important in those senses. And I'm talking about fintech specifically, and I'm talking about CBDC specifically. It becomes very crucial to perform these. And again, I think the lack of building security in comes from those inherited legacy frameworks, and plugging security at a very late stage becomes extremely difficult to enforce some aspects of security and security controls early on within a project. It becomes just you're trying to plug in components rather than building in security. Now, regulation, and I put it here is always behind, and I think it's an extremely important point to involve the regulatory body and policy makers into some of the systems that are being implemented on a national aspect, in fintech aspects. It becomes extremely important to involve them early on, so the line of thought and the issues gets resolved before the system is live and running, and then we hit issues with that. And the last point, I want to just call it technology risk creep. Just to give you a small example, if we go 15, 20 years ago, an operating system running within a university, you have some storage of research for some of the PhD students. Just an example, a hypothetical example. That server gets breached. You have to come back and revisit those research activities and research documentation and data. These consequences are definitely bad, but it's just confined into the research documentation. Now, fast forward, the same operating systems are now running autonomous cars, are running some financial systems that runs millions of dollars on a daily basis in terms of transactions. A hack into these systems now has different consequences. We have to keep that in mind. 15 years, same operating system, but different consequences. So when we're doing some risk analysis, these have to go into the decision making and into the defense in depth that we're implementing and enforcing on these systems. Now, I posed some questions, and I just want to briefly talk about these because we see a shift in some of the attacks and some of the thinking about these areas, and we still see some lack of security in protections and security and scrutiny and security into these areas. That I wanted to just pose the questions. Can we trust software in general? Absolutely, but you have to do your due diligence in terms of protection of that code, in terms of reviewing that code when you're integrating with systems, when these complexities are building up, when you're reusing libraries. You have to make sure that these are scrutinized and looked at. Extremely important. You definitely can trust software, but you have to do your due diligence and you have to protect these systems as well. Now, can we trust open source? With fintech, there's a big push to open source software. Open source has innovative ideas and innovative projects, and it's definitely something that any fintech companies, any central bank are now exploring. Fintech will be exposed to some level of open source software. Definitely trusting open source is definitely there, but you have to do your due diligence. The maturity level of an open source project is built by the adoption of that open source. It's not, there's not an entity behind that is scrutinizing and reviewing the code like closed source, although closed source has its own drawbacks as well. But open source is a community, and with adoption, basically the maturity of that software starts to go up because more and more people will start to look at that code, contribute to that code, and definitely improve it. Now, Open source has different way of looking at the publicity of exploits. It's on forums. You go in and you look at the vulnerability and a step-by-step way to exploit that vulnerability, because the community is trying to verify the vulnerability and develop a fix. So that's something that needs to be in consideration if a vulnerability is on a public stream, and someone is just looking at, a bad actor is looking at those and waiting and knowing that, for example, a CBDC or a fintech project runs on a specific technology. Things to be considered. The patching time is extremely important. In open source, the high projects, very active projects, develop a patch within hours. Within, I think the average is 4 hours. The less active projects develop a patch for a critical vulnerability within days, and in some cases weeks. So these are things to be considered when we're looking at open source, and it has to be reviewed by central banks when they're dealing with open source projects. Otherwise, they will be breached by these issues and lack of knowledge in it. Now, just to give a small example of the adoption, this is the top 4 projects. We took them and we looked at the critical vulnerabilities discovered. These are unique vulnerabilities. You can see in 2001, there was a jump into the discovered vulnerabilities for these largest 4 open source projects. And the reason is the adoption in 2010, because of the mobile devices, Android and other devices that came out. The adoption increased tremendously with the mobile apps and cloud computing, that it started to push the maturity of these projects up and the discovered vulnerabilities. So you see that line started going up in 2010, and that's when the mobile apps boom took place. I need to update the diagram into the 2020 and now 2021, but it shows you that adoption basically started pushing up the maturity of the software, the open source software of the largest projects out there. Now, just to look at the next steps and looking at moving forward with central banks and fintech and cybersecurity, zooming into fintech and CBDC, this is just inspired by NIST framework. We have to think about it from a framework that puts the regulatory aspects in perspective, that puts the monitoring aspects in perspective, risk and governance as well. It has to fit into those as we move forward with the fintech experimentation and the CBDC projects. This just shows that these components has to be measured, has to be compared. You have to have some way of reporting on these so you can improve and you can always be on top of the cybersecurity aspects and the operational aspects of fintech and CBDC. Now, in summary, and I want to focus on this, and this was in the table that we gave to the central bank example. We advise central banks to think about 2 things: the central bank itself, security posture, and the operational resiliency. This is an example of the CERT I think risk management profile and framework that goes into posture assessment, into asset management, configuration management, vulnerability management, risk management that we're covering in this presentation in great detail, external dependency, the training and awareness, the situational awareness. You can use any of the operational and posture assessment frameworks out there. There are regional and international, but this gives you an example of some of the areas that will be tested with a fintech project or a CBDC project. Just to give an example, if you are running a fintech system that is distributed, that you have servers within the cloud, and your asset management is so weak, and a vulnerability was discovered in a specific version of an operating system that you're running, it will be extremely difficult for your team to identify what assets needs to be updated. Now, move to a central bank that has a very strong asset management, it will take them minutes, maybe less, 5 minutes, to identify the servers and have a list and have an action plan of how to patch these servers. And I've worked in institutions that struggled in finding these servers, and we had to identify them and run tools, and the identification took a day or 2 until we started patching. and that's a critical vulnerability. So central banks has to look at these configuration management, vulnerability management, extremely important when we're dealing with the CBDC and fintech projects as well. Now, there's also an infrastructure assessment. It should be included with the posture assessment, but I wanted to spell it out because in some cases, if you're running, for example, a virtual environment, you need specific platforms and capabilities to monitor that environment if you're running critical components and critical systems on that virtual environment. So looking at your infrastructure and doing an assessment on the platforms and tools and things that you're running will become also something that the central banks need to go back and to look into and do an assessment in terms of that. The second component that we want the central banks to focus on is the security activities and what the projects are developed and the development of these projects. There's always the way that, and I emphasized on this, to have a mindset, a threat modeling mindset early on in the project. If you properly integrated the security and the experts early on, the issues of security will be identified early, the security controls will be identified early, and no surprises will come at the project progresses into the other phases. Now, here we advise two layers of equally important, the business layer and the infrastructure and application layer. Within the paper that we published, it digs a little bit more into these areas, but we definitely think with these projects of fintech and CBDC, it becomes extremely important to pay attention to the business layer and the process layer and the infrastructure and the application layer. Now, just to give, and I want to start to wrap up so we can get to the summary. Just to give a small example, this is a waterfall, and it doesn't have to be waterfall. You could be using agile process in terms of your project lifecycle, but you have to start thinking of shifting left the risk management and involving the security team and experts early on in the project, in the requirement phases to put the requirements, in the solution selection and looking at the solutions that are being proposed, in the design of the solutions, in the development, even the development when you're doing unit testing and code review. You can't do code review on all of the code of any project. You will have to make sure to identify the critical components and run those to some degree, and maybe rely on some of the automated tools when you're doing some of the other components to pick up the low-hanging fruits there. Testing becomes extremely important. Deployment and maintenance of maintaining that system at that level of assurance becomes extremely important to look and continuously monitor and test and improve as you mature into that project. To just shift gears at the end and before we start to go into the summary, one of the things that central banks will have to look at more specifically, and it goes back to the point of the political risk profile, is the threat actors. When we're dealing as a small company, we may be thinking about insiders, hacktivists, or maybe cybercrime here or there. But when we start to look at government institutions and central banks specifically, and we know some of the central banks who are extremely vigilant because of some of the national states and foreign states interfering, it becomes very different in the way that you're putting protections and putting resourcing and building your team. Protections against, of course, national states is different than APT, is different than cybercrime. I don't want to go into the motives and possible impacts, but it's extremely important for central banks to look into those, to keep that in mind as they progress with some of their central bank digital currency or any of their fintech solutions that they're regulating or putting some services within their nations. So to wrap up, just a small view of cost. In 2016, Gartner came up with a report that organizations are spending an average of 5.6 of their overall IT budget into IT security and risk management. 2019, only 3 years later, that number jumped into 10%. And in 20 and 21, that number increased to 15. Maybe the pandemic forced an increase in that number, but the the number increased to 15% in these organizations spending in security as they move forward. That gives you a little bit of an indication of the resources that needs to be pushed and put into some of these central banks to make sure that these their cyber resiliency and their operational resiliency is beefed up and has no gaps. Their activities and security activities that is performed on projects, and the threat modeling and the security architecture risk analysis is actually put onto the projects in the early stages of the project. So these becomes extremely important. And we've spoken with a number of central banks exploring fintech, exploring CBDC, and we haven't seen an increase in some of their spending on security. And that is one of the areas that we highlight, that an increase in responsibility, an increase of exposure into systems in fintech and CBDC will require an increase into some of the resources, either spending or even acquiring skills within the central bank, or even delegating to some of the experts out there. Now, to wrap up this component about spending, for central banks, it will heavily depend on the central bank risk appetite. A risk appetite of medium is completely different than risk appetite of a low in terms of spending and preparedness. And it will also be impacted by the fintech strategic goals that the central bank is having. And these fintech projects will be defined by the use cases and the scope that will definitely require much more heavy involvement of security and scrutiny than other systems, with examples of retail CBDC or a more closed CBDC or wholesale in terms of offline capabilities or not, and the reach of these CBDC systems or fintech projects. And finally, it depends on the existing gaps within the central bank security posture and cyber resiliency. Goes back again, do we have really solid procedures within the central bank, or do we really need to spend and beef up our security operational center, beef up our asset management, the usage of tools, platforms, and the infrastructure? These will depend on these will impact the cost for these central banks before they start to delve into fintech and CBDC and other of these projects. Now, to jump into the summary and recommendations, I will hand it back to Ashraf.
Thank you very much, Majid. And this is the final slide from our side. And I realize at this point, it's a mind-boggling number of details and insights that we've shared with you on, as Majid also highlighted, fintech developments, which are increasing, increased expenditure on IT and cybersecurity and risk management in general, though not enough, and a significant increase in issues, whether they're incidents or other related risks related to fintech and cybersecurity for central banks, but for organizations as a whole. So if you hear all of this and everything that we've mentioned now over the past 1.5 hours, what do you do? What do you do as a central bank and a financial supervisor? So we kind of try to narrow it down to 5 main recommendations that cover everything that we've said just now. The first one is address risks. And these are open doors. But again, mind you, this is not what central banks are necessarily doing, because everybody is eager to start working with fintech solutions in one form or another. So address risks. And the main thing to do that, main thing to ensure you're doing that, is to have a dedicated independent risk management function in your central bank supervisor. The second thing is stay on top. That means that governors, board members, staff as well, but especially these key decision makers in the central bank need to be fintech fit and proper. They need to be trained or regularly debriefed or updated in one form or another on what is happening in the technology realm as far as it's relevant for the central bank. This also means that they can then use it in the strategic planning cycle of the central bank, as we already mentioned. Third recommendation, get data. Data is critical. That means that cooperation between the different units in the central bank and supervisor need to be established to ensure that if a fintech unit reaches out and has discussions with fintechs and incumbent banks on fintech developments, that data also reaches the risk management office, the IT department, internal audit, etc. That also implies that there are clear reporting lines to the board and management on fintech and cybersecurity risks. Too many central banks we've seen where the reporting lines go via one deputy governor, another deputy governor, and the data gets all murky and not very clear. And that won't help decision makers like the governor to make clear-cut decisions. The fourth one ties into that, avoid silos, which basically means if you do set up a fintech department, if you have a separate IT department, you have separate risk management, you have separate financial supervision in your central bank, don't let it fall into silos, as is often currently already the case. And I mentioned earlier legacy issues of an internal organization. Fintech is moving fast, cyber is moving fast, your organizational structure cannot lag behind. Avoid silos at all costs. And the last one, be vigilant. This is what Majid already mentioned, the cyber resilience that needs to be improved and the security posture that needs to be strengthened. And I think his points on the expenditure that's needed from an IT perspective, and it's grown, is a very clear-cut case. Sorry, Majid, I don't know if you want to add something to this on this last recommendation.
I think you've covered it very well. In the improvement of cyber resiliency has to keep in mind avoidance of course, any breach taking place, but also improving your recovery time if a breach happens and minimizing the consequences. And that requires a lot of emphasis in the security in the early stages of any project and a strong cyber resiliency and a security posture for any of these central banks.
Excellent. I think with that, we've come to the conclusion of our presentation. We'll hand it back to you, Vasily, please.
Dear Ashraf, dear Majid, thank you for the presentation.